Hey all, here are OS Reviews. Some of you guys may remember that about this time last year, we checked out the Celero5G Plus, which was a pretty good value-oriented Android smartphone selling for sub $200, and it was a exclusive to Boost Mobile. Actually offered quite a lot of features for the money, including Qi wireless charging support, a Snapdragon 695 processor, as well as a really large 7-inch display at 120 Hz. So today we're taking a look at the next generation model, which is the Celero3 5G Plus, essentially the 2024 refresh of the device, and it comes with upgraded specs all around, including a more impressive camera, boosted to 108 megapixels, up from 50 megapixels on the prior generation, as well as more storage and RAM. So previously there was 6 gigabytes, now there's 8 gigs of RAM, there was 128 gigs of built-in storage, now this one upgrades it to 256 gigabytes of storage out of the box, which is further expandable via a micro SD card. Quite impressive for a similar, affordable price point that they're trying to hit. Now it still comes in similar colors. This model is the blue edition, but it also comes in orange, just like last gen if you want something a little bit more vibrant, and also comes in gray if you want just a more conservative shade as well. Just like last gen's model, this is actually one of the largest Android smartphones that you can find on the market currently when it comes to screen size, still measuring 7 inches diagonally. It's still a 1080p IPS LCD screen and still retains the fast 120 Hz refresh rate. This time around it is slightly brighter, getting up to 400 nits, and then some of the other cameras that we have on the rear include an 8 megapixel wide angle, there's a macro for close-up shots, as well as a depth sensor for bokeh effects, and a 16 megapixel front-facing camera, along with a pretty large 5,000 milliamp hour capacity battery. You'll also find a SIM ejector tool, as well as a braided USB Type-C charging and sync cable. When it comes to the build, first impressions being that it actually is quite similar to last gen in the sense that there is kind of this frosted matte texture on the rear. Feels pretty premium and resists fingerprints, has a slight gradient effect as you're shining it across the light. And this time around, the camera array on the left-hand edge does protrude from the side of the phone compared to last gen, which was completely flat. That I thought was actually quite a nice design touch since it doesn't really wobble on a surface or desk. But that's a trade-off to having a higher quality sensor as well as having one extra camera. In fact, if you look really closely, last gen's model had 3 lenses with an LED flash. This time around, there are actually 1, 2, 3, 4, and there is an extra depth sensor on here for, again, bokeh. It kind of reminds me of a fusion between a Galaxy S24 and something like the newest iPhone 15, for example, in its aesthetics. Definitely not bad. The edges this time around are slightly more curved off and rounded compared to last year's, which was completely flattened, as you can tell there, melting into your hands just a little bit better, which is an improvement because it is a large phone at the end of the day. On the right-hand edge, you'll still find access to the volume rocker, as well as a fingerprint scanner integrated into the power key, which is pretty fast and responsive. This time around, the keys are slightly shifted higher up on the phone, which is actually good, because on last gen's model, I found the position to be a little bit too low. So this is a good improvement as well, a very subtle one. The very bottom here does still feature the 3.5mm headphone jack, really a rarity in this day and age, along with the Type-C port and also loudspeaker. Now, the Celero3 5G, just like last year's model, though, is still a single speaker setup, so there is no stereo speaker built on in, though that's still kind of expected, I would say, at this price range typically. That being said, this time around there are some additional software optimization tricks in the audio department that we'll take a look at later on in this video. There's also the SIM card tray / micro SD card slot here on the left, and that is more or less it. I will say though, interestingly enough, this year's model does seem to be just a hair longer here on the edge, as you can tell there. In fact, if we compare the phones here on the front, you will tell that the bezel sizes haven't really dramatically reduced compared to last gen, which had just a little bit of a larger chin at the bottom there, kind of expected for a more budget-oriented phone, and perhaps an area in its design and hardware that we'll see further improvements on in later gen models. That being said, the screen quality itself is definitely not shabby. As an IPS LCD screen, we have very good viewing angles, and both of these screens are currently at 100%, so you can tell that side by side, this model is a pretty significant boost compared to last gen's model when it comes to visibility, so brightness is now easier to see when there's a bit of sunlight and ambient light around you. Still not quite as glaringly bright as on some OLED panels on the market, but for this price range, I think it's still acceptable. And the 120 Hz refresh rate means that if you're scrolling down longer lists and menus, it does feel quite smooth and responsive. And that's also partly helped by the processing package underneath, which has been further upgraded compared to last year's Snapdragon 695. This time around, they're using the MediaTek 6879, also known as the Dimensity 1050. And although MediaTek in the past hasn't had as good of a reputation as Qualcomm. That stereotype is starting to get broken by a lot of their newer chips, which have improved significantly compared to years past. Last year had an Antutu score benchmark of around 444K, versus this year's 1050 scores north of 565K. It's actually a pretty large bump, especially in the GPU department, this time scoring around 143K, versus last year not even getting to 100K, only scoring about 81,000 points. In fact, the Dimensity 1050 is comparable in system performance to Snapdragon 855, which of course was a flagship processor of yesteryear, but you can tell that in terms of CPU and GPU, it comes impressively close to it overall. In fact, even better efficiency because of the 6nm architecture being used on that chip, and compared to a more recent Snapdragon chips, it's more closely aligned to some of the higher-end Snapdragon 700 series chips when it comes to CPU performance, again, compared to the 600 series from last year. Now, of course, benchmarks are one thing, but in real-world usage, I found that this was a case that the higher-end specs did make a difference. Everything from unlocking the phone to overall system performance just felt even more fluid compared to last year's device, which at the time already felt quite responsive. By comparison, you can tell it has some slight moments of hesitation here and there, which are completely gone on this generation, because this is closer to, again, an older flagship processor underneath compared to more of a mid-ranger on here. And as far as software is concerned, we are getting a very stock version of Android without too much customization going on here at all. Super clean and currently running on Android 13 with a promised upgrade to Android 14 down the road. Of course, in an ideal world, we get even longer OS support akin to that of Samsung's Galaxy devices and also the Pixel phones, but it's certainly better than nothing, especially on a budget smartphone like this. That being said, one slight con versus last year's model is there is a little bit more bloatware from Boost Mobile when you first take it out of the box and you activate the phone. You'll find some quote-unquote essential apps, including TikTok, as well as some promoted games that get advertised and installed on your homepage, as you can tell there. Luckily, all of these applications can be completely removed and uninstalled, giving you a clean version of the software experience, but that is one change versus last year that came with virtually no bloatware or preloaded apps at all. And speaking of, you have plenty of storage space, as aforementioned, with over 200 gigabytes to install additional content, take plenty of photos with the camera, and that space can still be, again, augmented by a micro SD card. As for some other subtle details in the software, there is support for gestures including double tap to wake up the phone, as well as lift to wake up the screen as well. And I found that the font size scaling properties at least seem to be a little bit more reasonably tuned out of the box on this year's revision. On last year's model, it tended to be a little bit on the large side, giving it a bit more of a cartoonish look, with all the icons just taking up a bit more space. Of course, you can manually scale that down by tweaking the display properties, but this is done just a little bit better out of the box, I feel, on this year's model. Connectivity options are pretty much fully stacked on here, including NFC, GPS, Bluetooth, as well as Wi-Fi, and of course 5G cellular support. It's all in here. There's also a shortcut this time around for what they call Boost Max Audio, which is the aforementioned software optimization that can use some additional profiles for sound, including for music versus for videos versus for gaming. That slightly changes the equalizer, basically, similar to on some TWS wireless headphone apps that we've seen in the past. You can also go into advanced settings to further tweak some of the sliders, including virtual surround sound mode, as well as bass boost, treble boost, and voice enhance if you are looking at a podcast, for example. So this is a neat idea, I suppose, but still not quite as convincing, of course, as having an actual stereo speaker in the earpiece. But at the very least shows that they're aware and trying to make some improvements in that area, and everything else has been pretty much left untouched compared to stock Android. And speaking of the 5,000 milliamp hour capacity battery, it's more than good enough for lasting about a day and a half of moderate usage before I have to plug it in again, or around 2 days if I'm lighter on phone use. It's also neat that there is, again, Qi wireless charging support. Just popping it onto any mat will begin that process automatically. It's not really a feature that we typically see on budget-oriented devices, and it gets up to 15 watts in this wireless charging mode. Now, you'll also find a handful of custom wallpapers from Boost Mobile that showcases kind of the vibrancy of the display as well. And there's not too much bleeding on the edges either, so it looks like a fairly uniform and decent quality panel. The Assistant at a Glance widget, which is built on in, is also reminiscent of on Pixel phones, where it will change the information being displayed depending on context. Taking a quick look at the camera next, you'll find an AI scene detection mode that will know if you're pointing at food versus people, changing the properties like color automatically. There's also HDR that you can turn on and off, as well as toggle things like resolution details. By default, it will shoot in a 4x3 12 megapixel shot, but you can further crank that up to 108 megapixels. Google Lens integration for searching up objects can also be found down below, and you can tap here to go into the ultra wide angle lens, as well as further zoom on in here on the side, which is done digitally, again, since there is no telephoto lens built on in. You can also find the aforementioned portrait mode. There's also a beauty mode that will slightly brighten up the skin. You can also find a night mode that will just increase the time to expose the shot to let in more light. Under more here, you can also find a professional mode that will allow you to change properties like ISO, shutter speed, white balance, and even focus can be adjusted manually. Time-lapse, slow motion, including motion photos can also be captured on here as well. Now, what I will say is when it comes to video capture, the resolution is still currently capped at a maximum Full HD or 1080p, which I suppose is one spec that I do wish they would have further improved on, giving you the option to shoot in 2K or maybe 4K, since the processing power in here should be more than sufficient for doing so. Now, when it comes to overall performance, I have to say that the software processing, the auto HDR, and AI have been doing a pretty decent job when it comes to making colors that are still quite attractive looking, but lifelike enough. That being said, all of the lenses on here don't really have optical image stabilization, which again is expected for a budget phone. So especially for the macro lens, you do have to hold quite still if you want to get crisp and sharp enough looking images. And as a whole, again, in outdoor conditions, even if you are capturing things in a little bit more low light because of the HDR, it seems to be doing a good job of still preserving some details in the shadows and having a quite decent depth effect just by tapping on objects a little bit closer to the lens. So in general, focusing as well as capturing shots wasn't too problematic. And you can actually get some fairly attractive looking shots out of this camera, as you can tell here, such as food, including landscapes. I'm also pleased that some of the textures of the clouds and the sky color here is not getting really overexposed or blown out either. Here's also a quick comparison of the full 108 megapixel mode, which will take up about 25 megabytes of space compared to a regular 12 megapixel image will take up closer to around 5 megabytes, in which you can tell that this is as far in as you can crop on the 12 megapixel shot compared to the same exact spot on the 108 megapixel mode. You can go in just a little bit further and still see some of the textures and tree branches that are not going to be quite as easy to perceive. This is what the ultra wide angle lens looks like, so it's actually a little bit more contrast rich and oversaturated perhaps compared to the primary camera setup, but what's good here is you are able to get much more within the frame of the shot without having to step as far back, and also the lens distortion is handled quite well. There's not too much dramatic curving off at the edges despite the larger field of view here, which is good. It still looks quite straight. So as a whole, this is not a shabby set of cameras on here at all, especially again that primary lens with HDR and some of the AI shooting modes is surprisingly effective when it comes to the detail. With that being said, if you are shooting in a lot of low light conditions, even though there is that night mode per se, it's still not going to really beat the latest iPhone or Pixels for that matter because of the lack of OIS on board. But for this price range, really it's not bad at all, and I think it has improved compared to last gen when it comes to some of the software processing, plus the, again, resolution, of course, of that primary lens. Let's do a quick demo of what the speakers sound like next. Overall impressions being that it's actually not shabby for a single driver unit. It actually has a little bit of depth to it, doesn't distort too much at higher volume levels. Volume output is just around average, and again, having a true stereo mode would have been even better. That being said, again, a standard headphone jack as well as wireless Bluetooth support mean that you can further augment that with your own headphones or speakers if desired. Now what's good here is that the antenna reception quality seems to be very good because of the plastic frame here on the outside, and I wasn't really dropping any signal when it comes to both dual band Wi-Fi as well as 5G. Even in more rural location, I was still able to get almost full bars, and as a result I didn't have to wait too long when it comes to videos buffering up and loading back. And again, the display here is quite quite vibrant and contrast rich, so it's pretty to look at and still offers a very cinematic overall experience because of the large 7-inch size. Definitely is suited for some of these entertainment tasks, like watching back YouTube clips, doing some Netflix. So it's really not too surprising that other tasks, including browsing the web, can be performed equally well on this particular phone. Scrolling through longer, more complicated sites, as you can tell here, is still very smooth, and the upgraded 8GB of RAM on a budget phone is also quite impressive. Spec-wise, you're able to open up around 15 to 20 tabs in the background. I was still able to jump back and forth between them without things really reloading or re-rendering. As for the basics, including making phone calls and texting, they were also handled quite well. The microphone on here does have a background noise reduction to it, so if you're in a slightly more crowded environment, it cancels out some of that muffling and sounds generally clean and crisp enough. That said, I can't stress enough that this is definitely on the phablet territory. In fact, it is one of the largest Android smartphones coming out in 2023, 2024. So it makes devices like even the Google Pixel 6 and 7 seem small and petite by comparison. It still felt okay to me, but that being said, you do have to be kind of a lover of large screen phones to want a device like this. When it comes to gaming performance, it also is surprisingly competent, especially for a budget phone in this price range. There's plenty of horsepower here when it comes to GPU to handle even more demanding games, such as PUBG and Asphalt series with ease, and you are able to see more details as well because of the larger 7-inch screen size. The phone does get a little bit warmer if you're pressing it super hard for longer than say 30 minutes, but never still really overheats, and in general was still quite competent in terms of keeping performance at a fairly consistent level. So that is more or less it as far as our closer look at the Celero 5G Plus, again, the 2024 revision of the Celero 5G line. I will also mention that there is another slightly less expensive model of this already quite affordable budget phone, just called the Celero 5G without the plus at the end, which has a slightly lower end processor, camera, which is also just a slight step behind, not to mention a slightly smaller screen as well. So that can be something worth considering if you want to save even more. But honestly, I think the Celero 5G Plus is a worthy enough upgrade when it comes to specs, as well as just having a pretty unique position on the market as a large screen affordable smartphone that actually has some pretty solid performance. More importantly, kind of jumping from a Snapdragon 600 series chip now up to a nearly flagship level performer for this price bracket, and it's great to see when it comes to daily usage as well as even gaming, keeping up and still remaining quite fluid and responsive. So it is still an excellent value smartphone if you are considering going on to Boost Mobile, that is, and really shows that budget smartphones are also getting increasingly competitive here in 2024. So you can check out more details if interested in the links down below. For now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been the Celero 5G Plus.